42, I waited until my Amish husband died to open the drawer. What I found wasn't about me. The lamp was still burning when everyone left. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't touched anything. The neighbors had brought food. There were dishes on the table I didn't recognize, covered with cloth still faintly warm. The floor smelled of mud from boots. The door had opened and closed so many times that day, and now it was closed for good. And the house was the kind of quiet I had never heard before in 34 years of living inside it. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom. I looked at the drawer. I didn't open it. My name is Sarah, and this channel is where I share what life inside my Amish community taught me, slowly, quietly, and sometimes too late. If these stories reach something in you, please subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever waited to know something because you were afraid of what knowing would cost you? I want to tell you something I have never said out loud, not to my daughters, not to the women I sat with at quilting frolics for 30 years, stitching hexagons of blue and cream into patterns we had learned from our mothers, not to the deacon who came to the house after the funeral, who held my hand too long and told me Elias was with God now, as though that settled anything. I had known about that drawer for 31 years. It appeared in the 3rd year of our marriage, and I watched Elias place it, a small cedar cabinet, low, beside his side of the bed, and I never once opened it, not because I forgot, because I chose. Elias built it himself. I remember coming home from my sister's house one Tuesday afternoon in March. I know it was March because the mud was soft and I'd lost a boot, pulling it from the lane. And there it was, already sitting, already part of the room, as though the room had always held it. He was at the stove when I came in. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at it. Later that evening, I asked carefully what it was for. He looked up from his plate. He said, "For things that need keeping." I nodded. We ate the rest of the meal in the ordinary quiet of two people who have learned each other's silences. I never asked again. You have to understand something about the life we lived, about what Gelassenheit meant inside a marriage, inside a home, inside every ordinary day. Gelassenheit is the Amish word for yielding, for letting go. It is the idea that the self is not the center, that surrender is not weakness, but a form of grace. I had been raised with it, the way you might be raised with table manners or a mother tongue. It lived in my body before I had words for it. So when I saw that drawer and chose not to ask again, I was not afraid. I was practicing something I believed in. Some silences in the world I came from are a form of love. But I want to be careful here, because that is the truth, and it is also not the whole truth. Both things were real. I did believe in yielding, and I was also, somewhere beneath that belief, a woman who had learned that certain questions cost more than their answers were worth. I had seen what happened when a woman pressed too hard. My Aunt Miriam, not my blood aunt, but the woman we called aunt, the way you call every older woman in the community some version of mother. She had opened her husband's things too. Soon after he passed, within a week, she told me once, years later, that what she found changed the color of every memory. She didn't say what it was. She didn't need to. I watched her carry that changed color for the rest of her life, and I decided, quietly and without ceremony, that I would wait. So I waited, and in the waiting I built a marriage. Elias was not a simple man, though he lived a simple life. He was tall and slow-moving, the kind of man who seemed to take up more room standing still than most men do in motion. He hummed while he worked, low, tuneless, like something heard through walls. He pressed too hard with a pen. Every letter he wrote looked like it had been carved rather than drawn. He held my hand during Sunday service, not romantically, not demonstratively, just steadily, the way you hold something you are quietly glad to have. I loved him. That is the first thing. Whatever else I tell you, I need you to know that I loved him without reservation, and yet he had one habit I never understood. On the last Sunday of every month, without fail, after the supper dishes had been washed and the children put to bed, Elias would excuse himself from whatever we were doing and go into the bedroom. Alone, he would close the door. Not lock it, just close it, and he would stay for exactly 1 hour. I know it was an hour because I watched the clock the first few times, the way you watch something you are trying not to watch. He always came back to the sitting room afterward with the same face, calm, settled, as though he had laid something down. I never asked about that either. I filed it away in the part of myself I had trained to be still. The Ordnung shaped everything. Every hour, every decision, every question we thought to ask and then did not. The Ordnung is the set of rules, unwritten, mostly, felt more than spoken, that governs Amish life. What you wear, how you travel, when you speak in church, it is not a list. It is more like a current running beneath everything. And if you were raised inside it, you don't argue with it any more than you argue with the direction of a river. Our marriage lived inside that current. We were not lonely in it. We were, in many ways, deeply held by it. But it also meant that some things Elias carried, he carried alone, and some things I carried alone. That was the grammar of our love. It was not wrong. It was just quiet. 3 months after the funeral, I sat on the edge of our bed, my bed now, and I looked at the drawer. The lamp on the dresser was the same lamp. The floorboards had the same creak near the window. Everything in that room was identical to every night I had spent in it, except that the left side of the bed was flat and cold and would stay that way. I sat there for a long time, and then one thought came very clearly. He kept something. I was his wife for 34 years. I have the right to know who I was married to. I stood up. I crossed the room. I put my hand on the drawer and I opened it. It made a soft sound. Cedar on cedar, the wood swollen slightly from years of sitting closed. A smell came out first. Cedar, yes, but underneath it something else, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender. Though I couldn't be certain, I stood very still. The lamp threw a low amber light across the room, and my shadow fell long behind me. And for a moment I just looked. There were 3 things inside: a small folded photograph, a bundle of letters tied with the kind of plain brown string Elias always kept looped around a nail in the barn, and on top of everything, as though placed there deliberately, a single sheet of paper covered in his handwriting. I picked up the paper first. His handwriting was unmistakable. Deliberate, pressed deep, every letter leaning slightly forward as though hurrying somewhere. I had read that handwriting on 34 years of small notes left on the kitchen table. Gone to the Miller farm, back before dark. Your sister called from the phone shed. Nothing urgent. I knew it the way you know a voice. I looked at the page, and it took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. It was a list of names, women's names mostly, some men. People from our district. Next to each name a date, and next to each date a small notation in his careful pressed hand. Flour, 2 sacks. Next to one name. Wood delivered, enough for winter. Next to another. Children fed, 3 days. And then one that stopped me completely. Sat with her until morning. I read the list from top to bottom. There were 41 names. Some appeared more than once in different years, with different notations. I recognized most of them: women who had been sick, men who had lost harvests, families who had gone through something hard and quiet and had come out the other side without anyone seeming to understand how. I stood at the open drawer with that page in my hands, and I did not move for a long time. This was Elias's private record of every secret act of kindness he had ever done. He had never told me. Not one in 34 years of marriage. He had delivered flour and firewood and sat through the night with a grieving woman, and he had come home and eaten supper and hummed while he washed his hands, and he had never once said, "I did something good today." In our community, the Ordnung was clear on this. Good works done for recognition were not truly good. Charity performed in silence was the only kind that counted before God. Elias had believed this completely, but he had also quietly needed to remember. Not for pride, I understood that immediately. For something else, the private human need to know that your life has left some mark, even if no one else is allowed to see it. I sat down on the edge of the bed, not because my legs gave way, they didn't, but because something in my chest had shifted very slowly, like a door opening on a room I hadn't known was there. I had spent 34 years married to a man who hid his goodness the way other men hide their sins. The thought arrived quietly and stayed. I had worried, in the 3 months since his death, that grief would eventually show me something that would change the color of everything. The way It had for Aunt Miriam. I had braced for a different kind of discovery. I had not prepared myself for this, for the specific, tender devastation of being shown too late how deeply a person can love without ever once saying so. I set the list down and picked up the photograph. It was small, worn soft at the edges, the kind of softness that comes from being handled many times over many years. A young woman, dark dress plain, standing at the edge of a field I didn't recognize. I looked at her face and didn't know her, and then I did, the set of the jaw, the way she stood, slightly turned as though she'd been caught mid-movement. It was Elias's sister, Ruth. She had left the community the year before I arrived, before I ever knew Elias, and she had never come back. She lived under Meidung, shunning, and her name was not spoken in our house. Not once in 34 years. He had kept her face, in silence, in a locked drawer, in a life that had required him publicly to let her go. I thought about Aunt Miriam then, about the changed colors she had carried, about how I had spent 3 months frightened of finding something that would do the same to me, that would reach backward through the years and rewrite what I thought I had known. And I understood sitting there that Miriam's discovery and mine were made of entirely different things. What Elias kept was not a wound. It was a form of depth, a whole interior life of love and grief and quiet faithfulness that he had carried alone, because our world did not have a language for it, because yielding meant you did not speak your goodness, you did not speak your grief, you did not keep your shunned sister's photograph on the wall where anyone could see. You kept it in a drawer. You kept it in an hour alone on the last Sunday of every month. You kept it in the pressing of a pen on paper, 41 names, 31 years. I did one last thing before I closed the drawer. I found a pen on the nightstand, the same pen Elias had kept there, still half full of ink. I turned his list over to its blank side, and I wrote my own name at the top. Below it, I wrote the date. And below that, I wrote, I knew. I waited. I understand now. I folded it and placed it on top of everything, on top of Ruth's photograph and the bundle of letters I had not yet opened and would not open that night. I closed the drawer. I returned to the bed. The lamp burned low. The room was exactly as it had always been. The same walls, the same floor, the same window with its dark glass holding the night outside. But I was not the same woman who had crossed it. And if you have ever loved someone in silence, inside a life that didn't give you the words, I want you to know that the love was still real. The silence was not emptiness. Sometimes it was the most faithful thing two people knew how to do. And you are allowed finally to know that fully.